They paid me in cash because the Army's requisition system did not have a line item for indigenous guides. Sergeant Grishkov handed over the rubles every 2 weeks in a manila envelope, counted them out on a folding table in the supply tent, and made me sign a form that listed my services as contracted terrain consultation. I took the money, folded it into my jacket, and walked him and his men through another day of not dying near the wreck. This morning's route ran along the western perimeter, 3 kilometers from the fence line through ground I had walked since I was old enough to carry a rifle. The soldiers moved in a loose file behind me, their boots crunching through snow that had frozen and thawed and frozen again into a crust thick enough to hold a man's weight. Grishkov walked second, his rifle slung across his chest, eyes tracking the tree line out of habit. Behind him came 4 younger men whose names I had stopped learning after the first rotation shipped out, and new faces replaced them. They would be gone in 6 weeks. The land would still be here. "How much farther to the checkpoint?" one of them asked. I pointed ahead to where a concrete watchtower rose above the pines, its searchlight housing caked with ice. 15 minutes. "Is it always this cold?" "No," I said. "Sometimes it gets cold." Grishkov laughed, a short bark that fogged in the air. The younger soldier shut up and kept walking. The fence line marked the inner boundary of what the army called the exclusion zone. On our side, patrol routes, observation posts, supply depots built on the bones of old Soviet installations. On the other side, Red Sector, where the wreck had torn through the tundra 18 months ago and now sat half buried in ice like a cathedral that had fallen from a great height and shattered on impact. I had seen it up close exactly once, when they first strung the fence and needed someone to show them which ground would hold and which would swallow their posts. The hull was the color of steel left out through too many winters, its surface broken into massive plates that jutted at angles no human architect would design. Towers rose from the central rupture, frameworks of twisted metal that looked almost like trees if you did not look too long at the way they moved, slow as glaciers, grinding and shifting when the wind came from the wrong direction. They looked dead, and that was the worst part because dead things were supposed to stay still. We reached the checkpoint, a plywood shack built against the tower's foundation, and Grishkov keyed his radio. "Perimeter Team 3 at Station 7. No contacts, no anomalies." The radio activated. "Copy. Team 3. Hold position for equipment check." While the soldiers opened their packs and inventoried ammunition, I walked to the fence and looked into Red Sector. The land beyond the wire had changed, not in the obvious ways. The gouges where tendrils had broken through snow, the clusters of growth that wrapped around trees like blackened vines, but in patterns only someone who knew the terrain would notice. The stand of birch 100 meters out leaned differently than it had last week, listing toward the southeast as if pushed by something beneath the ground. A frozen stream I used to fish showed dark patches under the ice where there should have been solid white, and there, moving between the trees like an animal following ancient roots. Something the size and rough shape of a moose. Except moose did not have ribs like that. Overlapping plates grew from its sides, layered like the scales of some deep-sea fish, dull grey and fused directly into the bone. The antlers were wrong too, straight rods branching at hard angles, their tips catching the pale morning light and reflecting it in sharp points. It walked along what I knew to be an old migration corridor, a path reindeer and elk had used for longer than anyone could remember. My grandfather had taught me to track along that route. My father had hunted there. Now this thing followed it with mechanical certainty, head swinging in slow arcs as if scanning for something. "Yakov," Grishkov said behind me, "you see something?" "No," I said, and turned away from the fence. The patrol took another 2 hours to complete the circuit back to forward base Katanga, which was not in Katanga, but 15 kilometers southwest of where that town used to stand before the evacuations. The base had been built on the site of an old weather station, its original buildings now surrounded by prefabricated barracks, vehicle depots, and communications arrays that sprouted from the tundra like steel weeds. Soldiers moved between structures like boardmen performing the same tasks they would perform at any other posting. The wreck made this place unusual only on paper. I collected my payment from Grishkov in the supply tent, counted the bills, and was halfway to the gate when a runner caught up to me. "Major Volkov wants you in the command building." I stopped walking. "When?" "Now." Major Sergei Volkov had arrived at the base 6 weeks ago with authority that superseded the regular chain of command. Political officers always carried that kind of weight, though Volkov dressed it up with the title of Strategic Operations Liaison and kept an office separate from the regular staff. I had guided exactly 2 patrols since his arrival, and both times felt him watching through satellite feeds or whatever monitoring systems let men like him observe without being present. His office occupied the back corner of the command building, a space that had probably been a supply closet before someone decided it needed to hold classified briefings. The walls were plywood and plastic sheeting. A desk, 2 chairs, a field computer, and a corkboard covered with maps. Volkov sat behind the desk, reading something on a tablet. He looked up when I entered, gestured to the empty chair, and waited until I sat before speaking. "There is a problem," he said. I waited. Patrol 17 went into Red Sector 4 days ago. Standard reconnaissance route, experienced team, proper equipment. He tapped his tablet and turned it to show me a map with a route marked in blue. I recognized the path immediately. It skirted the eastern edge of Red Sector, where the terrain opened into what used to be good hunting ground before the wreck arrived. They missed their scheduled check-in. Their emergency beacon activated briefly, then went silent. Satellite imagery shows no movement at their last known position. "Then they are dead," I said. "Probably." Volkov pulled the tablet back, swiped to another screen. But they were carrying a hardened data recorder. Armored case, redundant systems designed to survive field conditions. That recorder contains the last 72 hours of biometric data, environmental readings, and mission footage. Central Command wants it recovered. "Send another patrol." The base commander already declined the mission. "Too high risk, insufficient tactical value." Volkov's expression did not change. I overruled him. I started to stand. Volkov raised one hand, palm out. "I need you to guide the retrieval team." "No. You have not heard the terms. I do not need to hear them. I guide perimeter patrols. I do not go into Red Sector." Volkov reached under his desk and pulled out a rolled paper, spread it flat across the surface with both hands. It was a large-scale map of the region, professionally printed with topographic detail and administrative boundaries marked in different colors. The current exclusion zone boundary showed as a thick red line forming an irregular circle around the wreck. A second line, this one in blue and marked with dated annotations, cut a much wider arc. "This," Volkov said, tapping the blue line, "is the proposed extension. Central Command believes current containment measures are insufficient. The plan is to establish a permanent biological research zone with enhanced security protocols and civilian exclusion." His finger traced along the blue line where it cut through terrain I knew intimately. The new boundary incorporates the eastern river valleys, the northern plateau, and the western forest tract currently used for seasonal grazing. My throat went tight. "That is Evenki land. It is designated federal territory. My people have used those grounds for 300 years. Your people will be offered relocation assistance and financial compensation." Volkov said it the way someone might describe a weather forecast. "The proposal goes to Moscow for final approval in 3 weeks. Once approved, implementation is immediate. Fences, patrols, restricted access. Anyone caught inside the new boundary without authorization will be detained." I looked at the map, at the blue line cutting through the frozen river where we drew water in summer, the plateau where we grazed reindeer, the forest where my grandmother was buried under a cairn of stones I had helped stack when I was 12 years old. All of it marked for annexation with neat, bureaucratic precision. Why tell me this? Volkov rolled the map up slowly. Because I can make an argument for a different boundary line. The base commander is not the only one with discretion in operational matters. If I attach a recommendation to my report, supported by successful mission outcomes and cooperation from local guides, I can suggest alternative exclusion parameters. Smaller footprint, adjusted boundaries that avoid existing indigenous use patterns. He set the rolled map aside. But I need justification. A completed retrieval mission, for example. A demonstration that local expertise provides unique tactical value. You want me to help you recover your recorder so you can tell Moscow I'm useful. I want you to help me recover the recorder so I can tell Moscow that displacing your community would complicate future operations unnecessarily. I stood up. Volkov remained seated, watching me with the flat patience of a man who had made this kind of offer before. If I refuse? The base commander's assessment stands. No retrieval mission. The recorder is written off as lost, and when my report goes to Moscow, it contains no special recommendations regarding local communities. He opened his hands, palms up. The annexation proceeds as planned. And if I go into Red Sector and die, then you die. But your family receives full death benefits under the Contracted Services Agreement. And I still have grounds to argue that the zone expansion should account for indigenous territorial claims. He paused. Better than nothing. I looked at the rolled map on his desk, at the computer screen showing satellite imagery of the wreck, at the man who held my people's land in his bureaucratic hands and offered it back in exchange for my willingness to walk into the place where patrols went silent. I need the agreement in writing, I said. Before I go in, specific boundary lines, signed documentation, filed copies, and I choose the team. No one I have not worked with before. Acceptable, within reason. The mission parameters require a technical specialist. We are sending Dr. Olga Kovalenko, xenobiology consultant, but the rest of the team composition is negotiable. I knew the calculation he was making. 5 people, maybe 6, against the chance to secure strategic intelligence and tidy up a political problem. If we succeeded, he got his recorder and could claim the mission proved the value of local cooperation. If we failed, he still had the recorder justification and could write us off as acceptable losses. Either way, the annexation moved forward, just with slightly different borders drawn on the map. But slightly different borders meant the river stayed accessible. It meant my cousin's children could still graze reindeer on the plateau. It meant the forest where my grandmother rested would not become a restricted military zone. I will do it, I said. Volkov nodded once, pulled a form from a drawer, and began filling in details. I watched him write, watched the specifics of the mission take shape in official language and administrative codes, and thought about the routes I had mapped over the past year. Every safe corridor I had shown the army, every stable path I had marked, every observation about how the land was changing, all of it feeding into the same system that now threatened to cut my people off from the terrain that defined them. The agreement took 20 minutes to complete. Volkov printed 2 copies, signed both, and handed me one. I folded it into my jacket next to the cash Grishkov had given me. Mission briefing tomorrow at 0600 hours, Volkov said. Team assembly and equipment distribution by 0800. Insertion into Red Sector by 1000. I left the command building and walked through the base toward the main gate, past soldiers who did not look at me because guides were not part of their operational structure. Past vehicles with treads caked in frozen mud. Past supply crates stenciled with Cyrillic warnings about contents and handling procedures. At the gate, I showed my clearance pass to the guard and walked out into the open tundra beyond the fence. In the distance, perhaps 5 kilometers north, I could see the darker line where Red Sector began, where the terrain shifted from familiar ground into something that followed its own rules. And somewhere beyond that boundary, past the patrols and checkpoints and observation posts, the wreck continued its slow work of integrating whatever it could reach into structures that looked more like forests than machines. I pulled my map from inside my jacket, a hand-drawn sketch on waterproof paper, marked with annotations in Evenki and Russian, routes my father had taught me, landmarks that had no official names, terrain features that only mattered if you planned to live here rather than temporarily occupy it. Over the past year, I had added new markings, the locations where tendrils had broken through, where hybrid creatures had been spotted, where the snow showed patterns that suggested movement beneath. And looking at those marks now, I saw what I should have seen months ago. The tendrils followed old roads, remnants of Soviet infrastructure that cut across the tundra in straight scars. The hybrid sightings clustered along migration routes, the ancient paths that animals had used for thousands of years and that my people had used just as long. Every piece of intelligence I had gathered, every observation I had shared with the patrol teams, had helped build a map of how the wreck was learning the land. I had told myself I was just guiding patrols, taking their money, keeping my head down, doing the work that kept my family fed without getting involved in the larger machinery of occupation and extraction. But the wreck was spreading along routes I knew, following patterns I had helped document, growing into the gaps in terrain that I had identified as strategically valuable. Neutral ground was a lie. There was only choosing which direction you walked, and I had been walking toward this moment since the first time I accepted Volkov's cash. I folded the map and put it away, turned back toward the base, and began preparing for a mission that would take me deeper into Red Sector than any guide had gone and returned alive. The sun touched the horizon and the temperature dropped, and somewhere in the distance I heard the sound of ice cracking under pressure, a sharp report that echoed across empty kilometers like a gunshot or a warning. The team assembled in the equipment depot at 0600 hours. Grishkov I already knew. He had rotated through 3 tours at the base and learned to trust my route calls without asking questions. The young conscript, Petya Sokolov, kept checking his rifle's magazine even though he had already loaded it twice. The drone operator, Dmitry Kulikov, tested his controller's range against the depot's far wall, watching the small quadcopter hover and dip in response to his inputs. And Dr. Olga Kovalenko, the xenobiology consultant Volkov had insisted on, stood apart from the soldiers with a field pack that looked too heavy for her frame. She was maybe 30, dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, wearing civilian winter gear that someone had tried to make tactical by adding too many pockets. She caught me looking and walked over. "You are Yakov Sidorov?" "Yes." "I read your deposition reports from the initial containment phase. Your observations about growth patterns were more useful than half the scientific assessments." She adjusted her pack straps. "I wanted to request tissue samples during the mission. When we encounter hybrid organisms, I need viable material for analysis." "No." "Major Volkov approved." I said no. I checked the ammunition pouches on my belt, felt the weight of my rifle. We go in, we find the recorder, we come out. Nothing else. Understanding the hybridization process could save lives. Then study the ones that are already dead. She opened her mouth, closed it, and stepped back without arguing further. Grishkov watched the exchange with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to get between civilians and contractors. Volkov appeared in the doorway at 0745, holding a tablet. He ran through the mission parameters without looking up from his screen. Entry point at the eastern gate. Route to Patrol 17's last known position. Retrieval of the hardened recorder. Extraction via the same corridor if possible, or alternate routes if the primary became compromised. Maximum mission duration 48 hours. Emergency beacon protocol if the situation turned critical. He did not mention what would happen if we failed to return at all. "Questions?" he asked. No one spoke. "Equipment check, final communications test, and departure at 0900. Volkov glanced at me. "I will be monitoring via satellite relay. Use the designated channel if you need tactical support." We loaded into a transport truck that took us to the eastern fence line, where a gate stood open between 2 watchtowers. The guards waved us through without comment. The truck stopped 50 meters past the boundary, and we walked the rest of the way into Red Sector on foot because wheels could not be trusted once the ground started changing. The trees came first. They still looked like trees from a distance, birch and pine growing in the same scattered clusters they had always formed. But up close, the bark carried rings of dull metal fused directly into the wood, grown through, as if the tree and the metal had been pressed together until they became one thing. Some of the rings were thin as wire. Others were as thick as my forearm, circling the trunk in complete bands that caught the morning light. Petya walked close to one of the affected birches and reached out to touch the metal. "Do not," I said. He pulled his hand back. "Why?" "Because I said so." We moved in a loose formation, me in front, Grishkov covering the rear, Dmitri in the middle with his drone circling overhead at 15 meters, and Olga beside him taking notes on a handheld device. Petya stayed close to Grishkov like a man walking through his first minefield. The ground crunched under our boots, snow that had frozen and thawed in cycles until it formed a crust thick enough to walk on, but thin enough that you could feel it flex with each step. A kilometer in, the terrain began to show more obvious changes. Shrubs grew between the trees with branches that held fragments of metal and bone. Small pieces caught in the twigs, as if the plants had grown through scattered rubble and carried it upward as they developed. A frozen pond off to our left showed dark shapes under the ice, too regular to be rocks, too still to be fish. Dmitri sent his drone down for a closer look, and the camera feed showed what might have been a fox or a hare twisted into something that looked like it had tried to turn itself inside out and failed halfway through. "Jesus," Petya whispered. "Keep moving," Grishkov said. At 2 kilometers, we found the first active hybrid. It was small, no bigger than a hare, crouched beside a deadfall of broken pine branches. The rear legs had been replaced with jointed rods that looked like they had been pulled from a radio antenna, straight metal sections connected at hard angles. When we approached, it bolted, and those rear legs drove down into the snow crust like drills, punching through and kicking off with enough force to send it 3 meters in a single bound. It vanished into the undergrowth before any of us could react. Olga stopped walking and stared at where it had disappeared. "Functional integration," she said, more to herself than to us. "The skeletal structure accepts foreign materials and maintains motility." "It means the wreck is turning animals into tools," I said. "It means the process is more sophisticated than current models suggest." She pulled out her handheld and started typing. "If we can capture a specimen—" "No!" She looked up at me, and for a moment I thought she would push the argument. Then she put the device away and kept walking. We reached a corridor where the trees leaned inward, their branches tangling overhead to form a canopy that blocked most of the daylight. Dmitri's drone feed showed the path ahead. A narrow avenue between 2 walls of bent trunks, the ground relatively clear except for scattered equipment. I recognized a rifle magazine, a torn pack, a helmet with the visor cracked and hanging loose. "This is where they came through," Grishkov said, examining the helmet. "Patrol 17. I knelt and studied the tracks in the snow. Boot prints, some of them doubled back on themselves, others dragging as if the person making them had been pulled. And underneath the human tracks, other marks, wide and heavy, pressed deep into the frozen ground. Something large had moved through here, and recently enough that the prints had not been filled in by new snowfall. "Stay close," I said. "If I tell you to run, you run. Do not stop to help anyone. Do not stop for equipment. You run until I tell you to stop." Petya's face went pale. Grishkov nodded once. Olga did not respond, but I saw her hand move to the sidearm on her belt, checking that it was accessible. We moved into the corridor. The drone flew ahead, its camera showing us what waited 30 meters farther. A grove where several thin trees had grown together into one thick pillar, their trunks fused at chest height into a single mass of wood and metal. And growing from that mass, like branches from a tree, were pieces of human equipment. A rifle barrel protruded from the wood at shoulder height. A helmet had been incorporated into the structure 5 feet up, its shape distorted but still recognizable, and lower, at waist level, a human arm extended from the trunk, the hand clenched into a fist that still gripped a tactical knife. We stopped moving. Dmitri brought the drone in closer, and the camera focused on the arm. The skin was stretched and translucent, showing dark shapes underneath that could have been bones, or could have been something else. The fingernails were intact. A watch circled the wrist, its face cracked but the hands still marking time. "Mother of God," Petya said. Grishkov raised his rifle and scanned the trees around us, looking for movement. I walked forward to the base of the pillar and looked up. There were 3 bodies incorporated into the structure, maybe 4. It was hard to tell where one ended and another began. Most of them had been absorbed deeply enough that only fragments remained visible. But near the top, perhaps 3 meters up, a face pressed against the bark-like surface from the inside. The features were flattened and distorted, but I could see the eyes, still wet, tracking left and right behind the translucent layer. The jaw moved in small, repetitive motions, working without sound. Olga came up beside me, her handheld already raised to record. "Extraordinary," she breathed. "The integration process is incomplete. Neural activity appears to be maintained even after structural incorporation." The eyes above us swiveled and focused on her device. The jaw worked faster. "We need samples," Olga said. "Tissue cross-sections, biomaterial analysis. This is the first documented case of sustained consciousness during hybridization." I unslung my rifle and chambered a round. The sound made everyone turn to look at me. "What are you doing?" Olga asked. "What should have been done when they found him?" "You cannot. That specimen is invaluable. The data alone could—" I raised the rifle and aimed at the base of the skull where it pressed against the translucent surface. The eyes shifted, focused on me, and something in them changed. "Wait!" Volkov's voice came through the radio clipped to Grishkov's vest. "Dr. Kovalenko is correct. That specimen represents critical intelligence. You are ordered to secure it for transport." I switched to the designated channel. "There is no transport. There is only a man who is being eaten alive while you watch. I am giving you a direct order." I switched the radio off and pulled the trigger. The round punched through the translucent layer and into the skull behind it. The jaw stopped moving. The eyes went still. I fired twice more to be certain, then lowered the rifle and turned back to the team. Olga stared at me with her mouth half open. Grishkov had not moved. Petya looked like he was trying to decide whether to vomit or cry. "We keep moving," I said. No one argued. The corridor opened into broader terrain after another half-kilometer, ground that used to be decent hunting before the wreck arrived, flat and open with good sightlines and plenty of game trails cutting through sparse tree cover. Now it looked like something had dragged pieces of metal through the snow in long parallel gouges, the exposed dirt beneath frozen into hard ridges. The drone feed showed movement ahead, large shapes between the trees, moving with the pace of grazing animals. Except they were not grazing. The first one I saw clearly was built on the frame of a moose, but layered over its ribs were overlapping plates of dull metal, each one the size of a dinner plate, fitted together like scales on a fish. The plating covered the shoulders and flanks, leaving only the legs and head exposed, though even the head showed signs of change, patches of bare bone visible through the hide, and the antlers rebuilt into branching rods that ended in sensor nodules that swiveled independently of the skull. It walked along what I recognized immediately as a migration route, one of the ancient paths that connected the northern plateau to the southern river valley. A path I had walked with my father when I was young enough to need his hand to cross the rough sections. Behind the first moose came 3 more, all of them plated and modified to varying degrees. And around them, moving in loose coordination, were wolves. Their jaws had been elongated and reinforced with metal teeth that protruded past the lips in irregular patterns. The front legs were encased in frameworks that looked like they had been built from scaffolding, straight metal rods connected at the joints with hinge mechanisms that should not have articulated the way natural bone did, but somehow managed it anyway. When one of them stepped forward, the framework absorbed the impact and distributed the weight in a way that let it move faster than it should have been able to on that terrain. "They are hunting," Grishkov said quietly. I nodded. The herd and pack were coordinated, positioned to cover multiple angles of approach, sweeping the corridor in a pattern that would flush out anything trying to stay hidden. And they were following the migration route with perfect precision, as if they had walked it 1,000 times before and knew every rise and depression. Because they had walked it before. When they were still just moose and wolves, before the wreck changed them, they had used these same paths. The wreck had not destroyed their instincts. It had weaponized them. "We need to go around," Olga said. "There is no around." I gestured to the terrain on either side of the corridor. Steep rises covered in unstable scree and broken by deep ravines that would take hours to navigate. "This is the fastest route to Patrol 17's position, the only route that gets us there before dark. Then we wait for them to pass." I shook my head. "They are not passing through. They are patrolling. They will circle back." Grishkov studied the hybrid pack through his rifle scope. "Can we fight them?" "Not here." I scanned the terrain and found what I was looking for. A frozen river that cut across the migration route about 300 meters ahead. Its surface white and flat, except for pressure ridges that ran down the center where the ice had buckled during formation. We moved fast and low, using the sparse tree cover to screen our approach to the river. Dmitri kept the drone high, watching the hybrid pack's position. They had not changed direction yet, but they were getting closer, their sweep bringing them toward the river crossing. I led the team onto the ice and then stopped, testing the surface with my weight. Solid near the bank, but farther out toward the center. I could feel flex under my boots. The ice here had formed in layers during the freeze-thaw cycles, creating weak points where the structure was more water than solid. "We crossed to the far side," I said. "Fast but careful. Step where I step. When we reach the bank, spread out and get ready to fire." We crossed in single file, my boots finding the strongest paths by instinct and old memory of how this river behaved in winter. Petya nearly lost his footing on a pressure ridge but caught himself. Dmitri's equipment pack shifted, and he had to stop to rebalance. Grishkov brought up the rear with his rifle slung and his hands free in case anyone needed catching. We made it to the far bank and spread out along the tree line. Dmitri landed the drone and pulled his rifle. I found a position behind a deadfall that gave me a clear view of the crossing and settled in with my weapon braced against the frozen wood. The hybrids appeared 2 minutes later. The moose came first, their plated bodies moving in formation, heads swinging to scan for threats. Behind them, the wolves ranged in a loose perimeter, their reinforced forelegs punching through the snow crust with sharp metallic sounds. They reached the riverbank and stopped, the lead moose lowering its head to examine the ice. The hybrid pack stood motionless at the water's edge, and I thought I had miscalculated, that whatever intelligence drove them had learned to recognize unstable crossings. Then the lead moose stepped onto the ice, and the others followed. They moved carefully, their weight distributed across 4 legs instead of 2, and for the first 50 meters the surface held. But as they reached the center, where the pressure ridges marked the weakest sections, the ice began to crack with sharp reports that echoed across the open space. The lead moose tried to turn back, but the ones behind it were still pushing forward, their combined weight pressing down on ice that was already failing. "Now!" I said, and opened fire. My first round hit the lead moose in the plating, punching through the metal and dropping it to its front knees. Grishkov and Petya fired in controlled bursts, targeting the wolves. Olga hesitated, then added her shots to the barrage. The hybrids scattered, some trying to retreat to the near bank, others pushing forward toward us. The ice gave way in multiple places at once, sections the size of truck beds dropping away into black water beneath. 3 of the moose went through, their plated bodies too heavy to float, dragging them down into the current. Several wolves fell with them, their metal-reinforced legs pulling them under like anchors. The ones that made it to our side of the river came up the bank at full speed, and we shifted fire to meet them. A wolf with a bent jaw framework charged Dmitri from the left. He swung his rifle, but the wolf was faster, hitting him with enough force to drive him backward into a tree trunk. The impact made a sound like a hammer striking meat. The wolf's reinforced forelimbs came down in a double strike, punching through Dmitri's chest and pinning him to the wood. He screamed once, a high animal sound, and then stopped as the wolf's metal teeth found his throat. Grishkov killed it with 3 shots to the skull, but Dmitri was already gone, his body held upright by the wolf's embedded limbs like a broken puppet. Behind us, more cracks sounded as additional sections of ice failed. I turned to see the last moose trying to reach the far bank, its rear legs churning in open water while its front hooves scrabbled for purchase on the edge. It made a sound I had never heard from any animal, a grinding mechanical bellow that carried across the river like a warning siren. Then the ice under its forelimbs collapsed and it slid backward into the water and disappeared. The wolves still on the far bank retreated into the tree line and vanished. The ones that had made it across were dead on the bank or thrashing in the water. Petya was sitting in the snow, breathing in short gasps. Grishkov pulled Dmitri's body away from the tree and lowered it to the ground with unexpected gentleness. Olga stood apart from us, her rifle still raised, staring at the carnage. "We need to keep moving," I said. She did not respond. "Dr. Kovalenko." She lowered her rifle slowly and looked at me. "You killed it, the fused soldier. You killed a living specimen. I killed a man who was being eaten. That man was already gone. What remained was an unprecedented opportunity to study. It had eyes. It could see us. If you want to study that, you do it after you put it down first." I reloaded my rifle and started checking our remaining ammunition. This is not a research expedition. "Then what is it?" "It is a transaction," I said, and started walking toward Patrol 17's last known position. We left Dmitri's body by the river because we could not carry it and make the remaining distance before dark. Grishkov took his identification tags and ammunition. Petya threw up in the snow and then followed us without speaking. Olga walked in silence with her handheld device clutched against her chest like it contained something precious. The terrain beyond the river showed heavier signs of change. Trees were bent at angles that should have broken them, their trunks twisted like wet rope and then frozen in those shapes. The ground rose and fell in small hillocks that I did not remember from previous surveys, as if something beneath the snow was pushing upward. And there, marking the entrance to a shallow valley, stood a cairn of stones I had stacked 3 months ago to mark a safe rest point for patrols. Except now the stones were held together by thin cables of what looked like frozen black liquid, and at the top of the cairn sat a human skull with empty sockets that tracked our movement. Petya raised his rifle. I pushed the barrel down. "It is already dead." "Then why is it watching us?" I had no answer for that, so I kept walking. We found Patrol 17's camp at 1600 hours, with 2 hours of usable daylight remaining. They had set up in a depression surrounded by low ridges, a defensible position with good sightlines in all directions. Their tents were torn and collapsed, the fabric shredded by something with enough force to rip through military-grade material. Equipment lay scattered across the snow. Packs, rifles, a portable stove that had been crushed flat. And at the center of the camp, half buried in snow that had been stained dark, was the hardened recorder. Grishkov secured the perimeter while Olga retrieved the device. It was a black case the size of a toolbox, with reinforced corners and a handle designed to be carried in one hand. She brushed snow off the surface and pressed a release tab. The case opened to reveal a screen and input panel protected by a transparent cover. "Operational," she said. Battery at 63%. Internal storage intact. Can you access the footage? I asked. She pulled out a cable from her handheld and connected it to the recorder's output port. The screen on her device flickered and then filled with shaky video footage. A soldier's helmet-mounted camera recording what he saw as he moved through terrain I recognized immediately. The valley we were standing in, filmed 3 days earlier. The camera panned left and showed other soldiers taking positions behind cover. Then it focused on something in the distance. A structure that looked like it had been built from trees, but was too regular to be natural, with walls that stood vertical instead of growing at angles. The soldiers advanced toward the structure, weapons raised. The camera followed them into an opening between two of the vertical sections, and the interior showed metal surfaces marked with Cyrillic text and warning symbols. Old Soviet infrastructure, buried and forgotten until the wreck found it. They found a bunker, Olga said quietly. On the screen, the soldiers moved deeper into the structure. The camera showed rooms filled with equipment still wrapped in plastic, weapons crates stacked to the ceiling, and in one section, a guidance system for something that looked like it had been designed to fly. The soldier behind the camera said something to his team, and then the footage jumped forward, skipping several minutes. When it resumed, the camera was pointed at the ceiling, which had begun to change. The metal beams overhead were being wrapped in something dark and organic that spread across the surface like fast-growing mold. The soldier turned his camera toward the exit and the footage showed it blocked by shapes that I recognized from the river crossing, scaffolding built from bones and metal plates, moving inward. The soldier ran. The camera bounced and shook. Someone screamed off frame. The footage cut to black, stayed dark for 3 seconds, and then resumed, showing just sky and tree branches rushing past. The soldier was on his back, being dragged. The camera swung wildly and caught a glimpse of something massive, a pillar of fused material that might have been made from several human bodies and what looked like pieces of destroyed vehicles, all of it threaded together with the same dark cables I had seen on the cairn. The footage ended. Olga's device showed a timestamp and a data summary. 72 hours of recordings, full biometric data from all 6 patrol members, environmental readings from the valley and the structure below it. They found something the wreck wanted, I said. Olga disconnected her device and closed the recorder case. A Soviet weapons depot, possibly experimental, likely abandoned after the incident in 1987. What incident? Classified. But the base was using this area as a test range before the exclusion protocols went into effect. She looked at the scattered equipment around us. The wreck is not spreading randomly. It is following infrastructure, seeking out metal, explosives, complex systems, because those things help it grow, because those things help it build. She stood and lifted the recorder case. We have what we came for. We should extract before dark. Grishkov returned from his perimeter check and shook his head. Movement on the northern ridge. Multiple contacts. They are between us and the route back. I climbed to the rim of the depression and looked north. In the failing light, I could see shapes moving along the ridge line. Groups of animals coordinated. The hybrid forest had found us, and it was moving to cut off our retreat. We cannot fight through that, Petya said from behind me. He was right. But the alternative was to stay here in an exposed position with no resupply and wait for them to close in. We would last perhaps 12 hours before being overrun. I pulled out my map and studied it in the fading light, looking for any route that would take us away from the hybrid pack and toward the fence line. There was nothing. Every path that led out of the valley would bring us across open ground where the hybrids could run us down. Except southwest of our position, perhaps 2 kilometers through difficult terrain, was the buried structure Patrol 17 had found. The one full of Soviet equipment and weapons, the one the wreck was already consuming. If the hybrids were responding to the concentration of metal and machinery, then that structure would be drawing them more strongly than we were. We could use it as a lure, circle around while they converged on the bigger target, and reach the fence line from a different approach. Or we could walk directly into the place where the wreck was feeding. "I need to make a call," I said, and switched my radio to Volkov's channel. He answered on the first transmission. "Status. We have the recorder, but the route back is blocked. Multiple hybrid contacts on the northern ridge." A pause. Then, "Understood. Emergency extraction protocol is authorized. Fall back to the designated coordinates and I will arrange air support. The designated coordinates are in the middle of Red Sector. We will not survive the wait. Then you are authorized to use any resources necessary to reach a tenable position." Another pause. "The recorder must be preserved. All other priorities are secondary." "Including the team?" He did not answer immediately, and in that silence I understood what I should have understood when he first offered me the mission. The recorder was the objective. We were the transport mechanism. If we died getting it close enough to the fence line for a drone recovery, that would be acceptable to him. "Do what you need to do," Volkov said, and ended the transmission. I looked at Olga, who had been close enough to hear the exchange. She met my eyes and said nothing, but her hand tightened on the recorder case. "There is another way," I said to Grishkov. "Southwest, through the structure Patrol 17 found. If we move fast, we can use it as cover and circle around to an alternate extraction point." "Into the structure?" Petya's voice went high. "Did you see what happened to the patrol?" "I saw them die because they stayed and fought instead of moving through." I pointed southwest. "That way, now, or we die here when it gets dark." Grishkov made the decision without discussion. "Move out, combat spread, Yakov on point." We left the camp in the last hour of daylight and headed into terrain that would take us deeper into Red Sector instead of towards safety. Behind us, the shapes on the ridge began to follow, and the temperature dropped as the sun touched the horizon, and the short Siberian day came to an end. The structure revealed itself gradually as we descended into the valley, a network of buildings connected by corridors that had been buried under decades of snowfall, and only exposed again where the wreck's growth had torn through the surface. What Patrol 17's footage had shown as a bunker entrance was actually the top edge of a much larger facility, one that extended underground in sections marked by ventilation shafts and access hatches that protruded from the snow like the masts of sunken ships. I recognized the layout. My father had brought me here once when I was 14, after the spring thaw had revealed one of the access points. He had told me this place was called Polygon 7, a Soviet weapons development site that had operated from the 1960s until something went wrong in the winter of 1987, and the entire facility was sealed and buried. He said the army had built it on top of our summer grazing grounds without asking permission, tested weapons that poisoned the water table for 3 years afterward, and then abandoned it when the test that failed killed 11 technicians in a single night. Now the wreck was digging it back up. We reached the entrance Patrol 17 had used, a vertical shaft with a ladder leading down into darkness. Grishkov tested the rungs and nodded. "Stable. I will go first." He descended with his rifle slung across his back, his boots finding each rung without hesitation. Petya followed, moving slower, his hands gripping tight enough that I could see his knuckles whiten, even in the failing light. Olga went next with the recorder case clipped to her pack. I brought up the rear, pausing at the top to look back at the ridgeline where the hybrid shapes had been following us. They were closer now. Close enough that I could see individual forms separating from the mass. Wolves with their reinforced frameworks. Something that walked on 4 legs but stood as tall as a man at the shoulder, and behind them a larger presence that moved between the trees without fully emerging into the open. They were herding us, pushing us toward the structure the same way hunters drove game toward a killing ground. I climbed down and pulled the hatch closed behind me. The shaft dropped 15 meters through rock and frozen earth before opening into a corridor wide enough to drive a truck through. Emergency lighting strips along the ceiling still functioned, throwing pale yellow illumination that reflected off walls made from poured concrete and metal panels. The air was breathable, preserved by the cold that had kept the facility frozen for nearly 4 decades. Grishkov had his rifle up and was scanning junctions as we moved deeper. The corridor branched in multiple directions, each branch marked with Cyrillic signs that designated sections. Storage 3A, guidance systems, munitions handling, experimental propulsion. The walls carried stenciled warnings about radiation exposure and chemical hazards, though whatever had been dangerous here had long since decayed into safer forms. We passed rooms filled with equipment still wrapped in plastic sheeting. Crates stacked floor to ceiling with inventory numbers painted on their sides. A break room with a table and chairs arranged as if the technicians had just stepped out for a moment and would return any second to finish their coffee. Olga stopped to examine a wall-mounted schematic that showed the facility's full layout, her handheld device raised to photograph the diagram. "This is much larger than preliminary surveys indicated," she said. "At least 40 separate structures connected by service tunnels. The main bunker extends 8 levels down." "What were they building here?" Petya asked. Olga studied the schematic. "Guidance systems for long-range delivery vehicles, experimental propulsion, strategic weapons storage." She traced a route on the diagram. "And here, at the lowest level, a reactor test facility." "They were making missiles," Grishkov said. "They were making everything." Olga pointed to another section of the schematic. "This entire valley is sitting on top of enough refined metal and explosives to build a small city." I understood then why the wreck had come here. It had landed in the tundra and sent out tendrils to search for raw materials, and those tendrils had found the buried test range the same way roots find water, by following the seams and corridors where humans had already concentrated everything the wreck needed to grow. Every ton of steel, every cache of explosive propellant, every complex electronic system waiting in sealed containers was calling to it like a beacon, and we had just climbed inside. "We cannot stay here," I said. "The hybrids are outside," Petya said. "If we go back up—" A sound cut him off, clear enough that we all heard it. A grinding noise that came from deeper in the facility, metal against metal, sustained and rhythmic. We froze, weapons raised, waiting to see if it would repeat. It did, 5 seconds later, followed by a sharp crack like ice breaking under pressure. Grishkov pointed down the corridor toward the source of the sound. "Something is moving down there." "The wreck," Olga said. "It is already inside the facility." We moved forward because there was nowhere else to go, following the main corridor as it descended in a long ramp that curved to the right and opened into a larger space. A vehicle bay with overhead tracks for lifting heavy equipment and loading doors sealed by massive hydraulic bolts. The doors had been pried apart from the inside, the bolts sheared off and lying on the concrete floor in pieces. Beyond the gap, I could see what the wreck had been building. The storage room on the other side of the loading doors had been transformed. The walls were still concrete, but they had been wrapped in layers of dark growth that looked like cables woven together into irregular nets. The nets hung from ceiling anchors that had once held lighting fixtures, and suspended in those nets were pieces of equipment, crates torn open and their contents integrated into the structure, guidance computers with their casings split and circuit boards dangling like ornaments and tucked into the corners, still wearing fragments of military uniforms, the bodies of Patrol 17. 3 of them had been incorporated high up in the nets where the ceiling met the walls, their limbs threaded through the growth and positioned as if they were climbing. Their faces were visible, eyes closed, jaws slack. The other 3 were lower, partially embedded in what looked like a pillar of compacted metal and bone that rose from the floor in the center of the room. One soldier's arm extended from the pillar at chest height, fingers spread, and from his palm grew a bundle of thin cables that connected to a guidance computer mounted on the wall. The grinding sound came again, and the pillar shifted, rotating slowly on its base. Petya made a noise in his throat and stepped backward. Olga raised her handheld and started recording. Grishkov aimed his rifle at the pillar but did not fire, waiting to see if it would present a clear threat. I walked to the edge of the loading bay and looked down at the scattered remains of equipment boxes on the floor. Mixed in with the rubble were data tablets, some of them still powered on, displaying mission logs and communication records. I picked up the nearest one and scrolled through the entries until I found what I was looking for: the classified orders Patrol 17 had been carrying. The first section was standard mission parameters: survey the valley, assess wreck expansion vectors, document hybrid activity patterns. The second section was flagged with security clearances above anything a normal reconnaissance patrol would need access to. I opened it and read the operational directive signed by Major Sergei Volkov. Priority Alpha: recovery of advanced weapons systems and guidance technology from Polygon 7 test facility. Secondary objective: assessment of target site for strategic thermobaric strike package. Below that, a third section marked Contingency Authorization. In the event of successful intelligence recovery, Field Commander is authorized to classify operational personnel as acceptable losses if extraction poses risk to recovered materials. Immediate airstrike protocols may be implemented to sanitize site and eliminate hybrid concentrations. Exclusion zone boundaries will be adjusted following strike assessment to incorporate newly secured territory. I read it twice to make sure I understood what I was seeing. Then I read the attachment that showed the proposed boundary adjustment. A map with the new exclusion line drawn across terrain that included everything within 5 kilometers, including the river valley my people used for seasonal camps and the northern plateau where we had grazed reindeer for generations. Volkov had never intended to negotiate. The mission was always about securing the test range's contents and creating justification for a larger annexation. The team was disposable. The recorder was the only asset that mattered. And my cooperation, my maps, my routes, my knowledge of the land had helped him plan exactly where to draw the boundaries that would cut my people off from everything they needed to survive. I'd spent a year telling myself I was just guiding patrols, taking their money and staying neutral. But there was no neutral ground between the wreck that was eating the land and the state that wanted to own what remained. Yakov! Grishkov's voice pulled me back. He was still watching the pillar, which had stopped rotating. We need to move. I clipped the tablet to my belt and walked back to the team. Volkov is going to bomb this facility. Olga looked up from her recording. When? As soon as he has the recorder and confirmation that we are clear. Maybe sooner if he decides we are taking too long. I pointed at the tablet. His orders authorize him to sanitize the site with airstrikes and expand the exclusion zone to include the test range. He gets the intelligence from the recorder, eliminates the hybrid concentration, and secures claim to 40 underground bunkers full of Cold War hardware. Then we extract immediately, Grishkov said, and leave him the test range. I pulled out my map and spread it on the concrete floor, weighing the corners with loose bolts from the loading bay. Look at the terrain. The wreck landed here because this is where the metal is. It followed Soviet infrastructure, pipelines, roads, buried facilities. Now it is feeding on Polygon 7, and when it finishes here it will follow the next concentration of old development. Which is here. I traced a line northeast from the test range, along the power corridor that connects to the river station, and here. Another line northwest, where the old mining roads run through the plateau. Both routes cut through the land Volkov wants to annex. Olga studied the map. The wreck's expansion pattern optimizes for material density, which means we can redirect it. I pointed to a cluster of marks on the map southwest of the test range, where older Soviet facilities had been built during the initial development push in the 1950s. There are 3 more decommissioned sites within 10 kilometers, older than Polygon 7, buried deeper. If we can make this facility active, power systems, radar arrays, anything that generates motion and electromagnetic signatures, The wreck will prioritize it over dormant targets. You want to lure it here permanently, Grishkov said. I want to feed it enough metal that it stops looking toward populated ground. I folded the map. The test range can consume it for years, maybe decades, long enough that the boundaries Volkov draws will not matter because the wreck will never reach inhabited territory. Petya was shaking his head. But we are inside the test range. If the wreck comes here, then we leave before it arrives. I looked at Olga. How long would it take to activate the facility's primary systems? She pulled up the schematic she had photographed earlier. The reactor is offline, but the backup generators should still function. If I can reach the main control station and restore power to the guidance arrays, they would generate enough activity to attract wreck growth. She scrolled through technical specifications. 6 hours, maybe 8 if the systems need manual recalibration. The hybrid pack will breach the facility before then, Grishkov said. Then we seal the lower levels and work fast. I stood and picked up my rifle. If we get the systems active and transmit confirmation to Volkov, he will see the test range becoming a permanent lure. He will still bomb it eventually, but not until the wreck is deeply embedded. By then we can extract through the western tunnels and the radio on Grishkov's vest activated. Volkov's voice came through, clipped and urgent. Team lead, respond. Grishkov keyed the transmit button. This is team lead. We are inside the facility. Status of the recorder. Secure. Dr. Kovalenko has the device. A pause. Then, acknowledged. New orders. Proceed immediately to extraction coordinates Delta 7. Air support will be on station in 20 minutes for emergency retrieval. We cannot reach Delta 7. Hybrid contacts are blocking surface routes. Then find an alternate path. The strike package has been moved up. You have 1 hour to clear the facility before bombardment begins. Grishkov looked at me, then at Olga. Sir, we have identified actionable intelligence regarding the test range. Dr. Kovalenko is requesting additional time to... Negative! The intelligence value has been reassessed. The recorder contains sufficient data. All personnel are ordered to extract immediately with available materials. Volkov's tone shifted, taking on the formal cadence of someone reading from prepared text. Under emergency authorization protocols, failure to comply with extraction orders will result in classification of non-compliant personnel as compromised assets. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Confirm your position and proceed to extraction. Volkov out. The radio went silent. Grishkov lowered his hand slowly and looked at me. He is going to bomb us anyway, Petya said. Even if we leave, he will time the strike to... A scream cut through the facility, high and short, coming from somewhere above us. We turned toward the loading bay entrance as the grinding sound returned, louder now, accompanied by new noises. Metal scraping on concrete, the sharp crack of supports breaking, and underneath it all a wet tearing sound that made my stomach tighten. Something dropped from the ceiling near the entrance purposefully, landing on the concrete in a crouch. It stood slowly, unfolding to a height of nearly 3 meters. The frame was built from what might have been a bear once, but the proportions were wrong. The torso had been elongated and reinforced with metal plating, taken from vehicle armor, bolted directly into the ribs. The front limbs ended in clusters of heavy fragments, pieces of artillery shells, their bases fused together to form blunt striking surfaces. The head was small relative to the body, skull exposed where the hide had been peeled back, and in the empty sockets where eyes should have been, clusters of lenses from optical equipment swiveled independently. Behind it came wolves in a loose pack, their reinforced frameworks clicking against the concrete as they moved. And behind them, filling the corridor, a shape that I recognized from the river crossing. One of the moose with layered plating, but larger, its body augmented with additional material until it barely fit through the passage. Grishkov fired first, controlled bursts aimed at the bare thing's center mass. The rounds hit the plating and sparked without penetrating. The creature lunged forward, closing the distance in 2 strides. Grishkov threw himself sideways, and the strike missed, but the creature's momentum carried it into the wall hard enough to crack the concrete. I fired at the wolves, dropping 2 before the others scattered. Petya was backpedaling toward the loading bay, his rifle up but not shooting, eyes locked on the bear thing as it turned to face Grishkov again. Olga grabbed the recorder case and ran toward the ramp leading deeper into the facility. The bear thing charged. Grishkov waited until it was 3 meters away and then fired a full magazine into its open mouth, the rounds punching through soft tissue into whatever passed for a brain inside the reinforced skull. It stumbled, crashed to one side, and slid across the concrete, still twitching. We ran deeper into the facility, following Olga down the ramp as the wolf pack pursued. The corridor branched, and we took the right passage, then the left, putting distance and corners between us and the hybrids. Behind us, I could hear them following, the click of metal limbs, the scrape of plates against walls too narrow for their frames, the grinding noise that meant more were coming down from the surface. The corridor opened into a wider space marked Munitions Storage 4B. Racks lined both walls, holding shells in various calibers, each one secured in cradles designed to prevent accidental detonation. At the far end, a blast door stood partially open, its hydraulic mechanism frozen mid-cycle. Grishkov reached the door first and tried to force it closed. The mechanism would not budge. Hydraulics are dead. We cannot seal it. I looked back at the corridor we had come through. Shadows moved on the walls, cast by shapes that were getting closer. We had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached the munitions room. "Through the door," I said. "Go!" Petya squeezed through the gap. Then Olga. Grishkov turned to follow and a wolf hit him from the side, coming out of a junction we had passed without clearing. Its reinforced forelegs caught him across the chest and slammed him into the wall. He brought his rifle up, but the wolf's jaws closed on the weapon and tore it from his hands, throwing it across the room. The second wolf came through and went for his throat. I shot it twice, center mass, and it fell. But the first wolf had already driven Grishkov to the ground and was tearing through his tactical vest with its metal teeth, shredding fabric and flesh. Grishkov got his sidearm clear and fired up into the wolf's skull, killing it. But the damage was done. His chest was opened in 3 parallel wounds. I dragged him toward the blast door. Petya reached through to help pull him through the gap. More hybrids appeared in the corridor. Wolves, something that might have been built from a lynx, and behind them, the massive shape of the plated moose grinding its way toward us. "Leave me," Grishkov said. His voice was wet. "Seal the room." "There is no seal," I said. "Then run." He pushed his sidearm into my hands. "Get them out!" I took the weapon and pulled back through the blast door. Petya was already moving down the corridor on the other side. Olga stood waiting, the recorder case clutched to her chest. Grishkov rolled onto his side and looked at the munitions racks lining the walls. Then he looked at me through the gap in the door and smiled without humor. He still had 1 magazine left in his vest. "Tell Volkov I quit," he said, and started crawling toward the nearest rack of artillery shells. I ran. Behind me I heard gunfire, sharp cracks as Grishkov emptied his magazine into explosive ordnance that had been stable for 40 years but was never designed to take direct, high-velocity impacts. The detonation, when it came, was not immediate. There was a pause, a moment of pressure building, and then a sound like the world breaking in half. The blast wave hit us from behind and threw us forward. I hit the ground rolling and came up with my ears ringing and dust pouring down from ceiling cracks. The corridor we had come through was blocked by collapsed concrete and twisted rebar. Through the ringing, I could hear Petya coughing, and farther away, Olga calling for us to keep moving. We ran through passages that descended deeper into the test range, following signs that pointed toward central command and primary systems. The walls showed more stress fractures from the explosion. Water dripped from ceiling joints where pipes had ruptured. Emergency lighting flickered and died in sections, leaving gaps of darkness we crossed with hands on walls to keep our bearings. The command center revealed itself as a large circular room with workstations arranged in concentric rings around a central platform. Computer banks lined the walls, their screens dark but their housings intact. Above the platform, a projection surface showed a faded map of the test range and surrounding terrain, marked with targeting coordinates and firing solutions that had never been used. Olga set the recorder case on the central platform and started examining the control stations. "I need power restored before I can activate the arrays." I found a wall panel marked Emergency Systems and pulled it open. Inside were manual switches for backup generators, each one labeled with the section it controlled. I flipped them in sequence and heard distant mechanical sounds as the generators kicked over and began running on whatever fuel remained in their tanks after 4 decades of storage. Overhead lights came on, weak and yellow. The computer banks started their boot sequences with sounds like grinding gravel. The projection screen flickered and resolved into a live schematic of the test range, showing structural integrity across the facility's 8 levels. Most of the upper sections showed red, compromised, unsafe, or already collapsed. But the lower levels, including the command center we were standing in, remained mostly green, sealed, stable, and fully functional. Olga was already working at one of the control stations, her fingers moving across a keyboard that should have been too old to recognize modern input protocols, but somehow still responded to her commands. "Guidance arrays are initializing. Radar systems are coming online. If I can establish a stable power feed to the primary antenna complex, it will generate enough electromagnetic activity to—" She stopped talking and leaned closer to her screen. "That is wrong." "What is wrong?" "The power draw. Something is already active on level 8. She pulled up a diagnostic readout. "The reactor test facility. It should be sealed and dormant, but it is showing active consumption." I walked to the projection screen and looked at the schematic. Level 8, at the bottom of the facility, showed green across most of its sections. But in the reactor chamber, there was an icon that I did not recognize. Not part of the original system architecture, but something that had been added to the display recently. As I watched, similar icons appeared in 2 adjacent chambers, then a third. "The wreck is already down there," I said. Olga stood and came to look at the projection. "That is impossible. The facility has been sealed since before the crash. The wreck should not have been able to penetrate. It followed the power lines, or the ventilation shafts, or it dug through 40 meters of rock because that is where the reactor is and it wants the metal." Petya appeared from a side corridor where he had been checking exits. "The way we came is blocked. The explosion brought down half the upper level." "Are there other routes out?" Olga asked. I studied the schematic, tracing the tunnel network that connected Polygon 7 to the surrounding terrain. Most exits led to surface structures that would be exposed to hybrid patrols or had already collapsed. But there was one route that extended west, toward the older facilities I had marked on my map. A service tunnel that ran for nearly 2 kilometers underground before emerging in a bunker that had been decommissioned in the 1970s. "There," I said, pointing to the western tunnel. "If we can reach it before the wreck cuts us off." "That tunnel passes through level 7, Olga said, "which means going down instead of up." "I know." She looked at the spreading icons on the projection, then at the control station where she had been working. "The guidance arrays need 10 more minutes to reach full operational status. Without that, the electromagnetic signature will not be strong enough to hold the wreck's attention long term. We do not have 10 minutes. Then the lure will fail. The wreck will consume what is here and move on to the next concentration, which according to your map is the power corridor that runs through." "I know where it runs." I pulled out the tablet I had taken from the loading bay and called up Volkov's annexation map. The blue line showing the new boundary cut through exactly the terrain the wreck would follow if it left the test range before being fully drawn in. We need to buy time. Olga sat back down at the control station. I can try to accelerate the startup sequence, but I will need to remain here to monitor the power distribution. If the generators overload, the entire system will shut down, and we will lose the lure. I understood what she was saying. Someone needed to stay in the command center to keep the systems running while the wreck closed in from below. And someone needed to carry the recorder out through the western tunnel before Volkov's strike package arrived. I looked at Petya, who was standing near the projection screen with his rifle held across his chest. He was maybe 20 years old, drafted from some city in the west, and sent to freeze in Siberia because the army needed bodies and he had been available. He had followed orders, stayed close to Grishkov, and done nothing to deserve being trapped in an underground facility while alien growth consumed it from beneath. "You need to leave," I said to him. "Take the recorder and head for the western tunnel. When you reach the surface, find Volkov's extraction team and tell them what we did here." "What about you?" "I am staying with Dr. Kovalenko. Someone needs to maintain the lure." He shook his head. "The wreck will—" "I know what the wreck will do." I handed him Grishkov's sidearm and the spare magazines from my belt. "Go now. You have maybe 40 minutes before this place becomes unsafe." He took the weapon but did not move toward the exit. He looked at Olga, then at me, and I saw him trying to decide whether to follow orders from a contractor who had no authority to give them, or to stay and die with people he had known for less than 12 hours. "Petya," Olga said quietly. "The recorder needs to reach the surface. That is the mission." He nodded, picked up the recorder case, and walked toward the corridor that led to level 7 and the western tunnel. At the doorway, he stopped and looked back. "I will tell them," he said, and then he was gone. Olga returned to the control station and brought up diagnostic screens showing power flow across the facility. "The arrays need 6 more minutes, maybe 5 if I push the generators past their rated capacity." I walked to the projection screen and watched the icons spreading across level 8. They were moving upward now, following the structural supports and ventilation shafts that connected the reactor level to the rest of the facility. In 10 minutes, they would reach level 6. In 20, they would be in the command center. "Can you lock the system to run automatically?" I asked. "Yes, but if something fails, a generator giving out, a power junction overloading, there will be no one to fix it. The lure will die within hours. Then we make sure nothing fails." She stopped typing and turned to look at me. "You are planning to stay longer than 5 minutes?" "I am planning to stay until the system is stable, which might be 5 minutes or might be 5 days. I pulled out my map and set it on the platform beside her station. "The wreck came here because this is where the metal is. If we can keep the arrays active, keep the facility generating activity, it will prioritize Polygon 7 over everything else. It will dig in and feed until there is nothing left, and while it does, my people will have time to adapt, to move, to find new ground that is not being annexed by Moscow or consumed by alien growth. You will die here. Maybe." I traced the blue line on Volkov's map, the boundary that would cut my people off from their land. "But this way, I get to choose what the wreck eats first." Olga nodded and turned back to her controls. "The arrays are at 80%. 4 minutes to full operational status." I switched my radio to Volkov's channel and waited for him to respond. When he did, his voice was tense. "Report. We are inside the command center at Polygon 7. Dr. Kovalenko is activating the facility's primary systems. I ordered immediate extraction. The situation has changed. We found evidence that the wreck optimizes its expansion for material density. If we can make this test range active enough, it will draw wreck growth away from inhabited terrain and hold it here permanently." I looked at the projection screen, at the icons spreading upward. "I am transmitting coordinates and schematic data now. You will see that the facility can serve as a long-term containment solution." A pause. Then, "You are inside the strike zone." "I know. The package is already in flight. Detonation in 32 minutes. "Then delay it." Give us time to stabilize the lure. Negative. The decision authority does not rest with field personnel. His tone shifted, becoming the formal voice he had used earlier. You are ordered to extract immediately with all available intelligence materials. The recorder is already en route to the surface. A member of our team is carrying it through the western tunnel. He will reach your extraction coordinates in approximately 40 minutes. And you? I am staying to maintain the lure. Someone needs to keep the arrays active while the wreck closes in. If the system fails before it is deeply embedded, it will redirect toward the power corridor and the mining roads, both of which cross the land you want to annex. Another pause. Then Volkov spoke again. You are choosing to die in that facility. I am choosing where the wreck grows. The facility is acceptable. My people's land is not. This does not change the annexation boundaries. It changes where the wreck will be in 5 years, 10 years. Long enough that the boundaries you draw will not matter because the threat will be contained here instead of spreading toward inhabited ground. I checked the timer on the projection screen. 3 minutes to array activation. File your report however you want. Tell Moscow I went rogue. Tell them I sabotaged the mission. Tell them whatever story keeps you employed. Just make sure that new boundary line goes where you promised. Volkov did not respond immediately. I could hear him breathing over the radio. Could imagine him sitting in his office at the forward base with satellite feeds showing the test range and the icons that marked our positions inside it. The strike window cannot be delayed, he said finally. But I can adjust the targeting parameters to focus on the upper structures. That will give you additional time to stabilize the arrays before the facility becomes untenable. How much time? Unknown. Hours at most. When the bombardment begins, the structural integrity of the lower levels will degrade rapidly. You should experience catastrophic failure within 6 to 12 hours after initial impact, which meant I had perhaps half a day to get the lure stable enough to run without intervention. Then find my way out through tunnels that would be collapsing around me while the wreck consumed everything in its path. Understood, I said. One more thing, Sidorov. The annexation boundaries. I will attach your recommendation to my report because you were right. The test range is a more valuable containment solution than the original projection suggested. Moscow will accept adjusted boundaries if the strategic assessment supports it. Thank you. Do not thank me. You are still going to die down there. He paused. Volkov out. The radio went silent. Olga looked up from her station. Arrays at full capacity. The lure is active. She pulled up a new screen showing electromagnetic output across multiple frequencies. It is working. The signature is strong enough to be detected from orbit. On the projection screen, the icons on level 8 stopped spreading upward and began to consolidate, moving towards the reactor chamber where the power signature was strongest. The wreck was responding to the lure, redirecting its growth towards the most attractive target. Lock the system, I said. She entered commands, and the screens shifted to automated monitoring protocols. Done. The generators will maintain current output until fuel depletion. Estimated runtime is 14 hours, plus or minus 2 hours depending on load variations. And after that? The arrays will go dark, and the lure will fail. She stood and walked to the projection screen, studying the icons that were now clustering around level 8. Unless someone manually refuels the generators and maintains the power distribution. I nodded. Then we have work to do. She picked up her handheld device and the tablet I had been carrying, clipped both to her pack, and walked toward the corridor that led down to level 7. At the doorway she stopped and looked back. I am staying too, she said. You do not have to, I know. She adjusted her pack straps. But this is better data than I will ever collect anywhere else. And someone needs to document what happens when we feed a Soviet weapons facility to an alien intelligence. I wanted to argue with her, to tell her she should follow Petya through the western tunnel while there was still time. But I knew the look in her eyes. She had made her choice the same way I had made mine, because it was the only choice that let her own the outcome instead of just observing it. "Generator room first," I said. "Then we see how deep we can go before the wreck cuts us off." We descended into level 7, following signs that pointed toward fuel storage and mechanical systems, walking into the belly of a facility that had been built to test weapons capable of destroying cities, and was now being consumed by something that treated human engineering as raw material for its own incomprehensible purposes. Above us, the countdown to Volkov's strike package continued. Around us, the wreck grew closer with each passing minute. And beneath us, in the reactor chamber at the bottom of Polygon 7, something began to change. Metal fusing with metal. Circuits connecting to structures that had never been designed to carry current. And in the spaces between, a new kind of forest taking root in the dark. The generator room occupied a reinforced chamber on level 7, accessible through a pressure door that had been designed to contain explosions. Inside, 6 diesel generators sat in a line along the far wall, each one the size of a cargo truck, connected to fuel tanks that descended through the floor to storage reservoirs on level 8. 3 of the generators were already running, their engines producing a rhythmic thudding that I felt through my boots more than heard. The other 3 sat silent, their control panels showing red indicators. Olga examined the fuel gauges while I checked the electrical connections that distributed power throughout the facility. The active generators were consuming fuel at a rate that would drain their tanks in less than 10 hours. The inactive units could extend that timeline to 14, maybe 16 hours if we could get them started. "The control circuits are corroded," Olga said, running her fingers along a panel where copper wiring showed green oxidation. "These generators have not been started in 40 years. The inactive units might not respond to automated commands." I found a tool cabinet mounted on the wall and pulled out a wrench set and wire cutters. "Then we start them manually." We worked in silence, stripping corroded wiring and bridging circuits with fresh connections pulled from supply crates in an adjacent room. The first inactive generator resisted for 20 minutes before its starter motor caught and the engine turned over with a sound like gravel being poured into a metal drum. The second unit started on the first attempt. The third refused completely. Its fuel lines had cracked internally and leaked diesel into the engine housing, making ignition impossible. 5 generators at current load," Olga said, calculating on her handheld. 14 hours until fuel depletion." I looked at the fuel gauges again. "How much is in the storage reservoirs?" "Unknown. The monitoring systems on level 8 are offline." She pulled up the facility schematic. "The reservoirs are in the same section as the reactor chamber, if the wreck has reached them. Then we need to know before the generators run dry." She nodded and clipped her device to her belt. "I will check the fuel status. You should verify that the guidance arrays are maintaining stable output." We split up. I returned to the command center and found the control stations running in automated mode, their screens showing power distribution and array status across multiple frequencies. The electromagnetic signature was holding steady, strong enough that it would be visible to the wreck's tendrils from kilometers away. On the projection screen, the icons on level 8 had multiplied, spreading through the reactor chamber and adjacent storage areas in patterns that looked like root systems searching for nutrients. The timer in the corner of the screen showed 23 minutes until Volkov's strike package arrived. I wondered if Petya had reached the surface yet, if he had made contact with the extraction team, if the recorder was already on its way back to the forward base. I wondered if Volkov would keep his word about the boundary adjustments, or if my cooperation would be filed away as another data point in a report that recommended full annexation, regardless of what I had done here. I pulled out my radio and switched to the emergency channel, the one that bypassed normal military frequencies and broadcast directly to civilian receivers used by communities outside the exclusion zone. My cousin Mikhail had one. So did the village elder and the families who still grazed reindeer on the northern plateau. "This is Yakov Sidorov," I said into the radio. I'm transmitting from inside the test range at Polygon 7. If you can hear this, you need to know that the Army is going to adjust the exclusion boundaries. They will try to take more land. Do not accept the first terms they offer. Make them negotiate. Make them show you the maps. The wreck is being contained here, at the old test range, and it will stay here for years if the systems hold. That means the land to the north and west is safe for longer than they will admit. Use that time. Move if you have to, but do it on your terms, not theirs. I released the transmit button and waited to see if anyone would respond. The radio stayed silent. Either no one had heard the broadcast, or they had heard it and chosen not to acknowledge over an open channel that the Army might be monitoring. I switched back to Volkov's frequency and keyed the transmit button. The lure is stable. Fuel supply is sufficient for 14 hours of continuous operation. After that, someone will need to manually refuel the generators, or the arrays will go dark. Volkov responded immediately. You have 12 minutes until the first munitions reach target. Recommend you seal yourself in the command center and avoid upper levels. Understood. The adjusted boundary maps will be filed with my report. Your village and the northern plateau will remain outside the new exclusion line. A pause. For what that is worth. It is worth 14 more hours than we had yesterday. Perhaps. Another pause. Strike package is on final approach. This is your last opportunity to extract. I am exactly where I need to be. Then good luck, Sidorov. Volkov out. The radio went silent. I set it on the control platform and watched the countdown timer reach 8 minutes, then 7. Somewhere above me, aircraft were closing on the test range, carrying enough explosive force to flatten every surface structure and collapse most of the upper underground levels. The lower levels, the ones I was standing in, had been built to survive near-miss strikes from strategic weapons. They would hold, probably. Olga returned from level 8, moving fast, her face showing tension I had not seen before. The reservoirs are full, enough diesel to run the generators for 6 months, maybe longer. She stopped at the control platform and pulled up new data on her device. But the fuel pumps are offline. The wreck has grown through the pump housing and severed the electrical connections. Can you repair them? Not without going down to level 8. And the access corridor is compromised. The wreck is actively incorporating the structural supports. She showed me her device's screen, which displayed a camera feed from her earlier descent. The corridor leading to the reactor level was no longer recognizable as human construction. The walls had been wrapped in layered growth that looked like cables woven into irregular mesh, and from that mesh hung pieces of equipment, pumps, junction boxes, lengths of pipe. All of it threaded together in patterns that served no obvious function. How long until the active generators run dry? 11 hours if we maintain current load, less if power demand increases. I studied the camera feed, looking for any clear path through the growth. If we can reach the pump housing and restore power, the fuel will flow automatically. The wreck will be in that corridor. We would have to move through it. I know. She looked at me and nodded, then started gathering tools from the supply cabinet. Heavy cutters, insulated gloves, a portable work light. I found a pry bar that would serve as a weapon if we needed it, and checked the ammunition in Grishkov's sidearm. The countdown timer reached 4 minutes. I grabbed the radio from the control platform and clipped it to my belt. We should be below level 6 when the strike hits, I said. We descended through level 6 without incident, passing through chambers that held more equipment crates and monitoring stations that had been abandoned mid-shift when the facility was sealed. At the entrance to level 7, Olga stopped and raised her hand. Do you hear that? I listened. Underneath the generator noise and the ambient sounds of a facility that had been dormant for decades, there was a new sound, a grinding rhythm, like something large dragging itself across concrete. It is moving up from level 8, Olga said. We continued down to level 7 and followed the signs toward reactor access. The corridor narrowed, and the walls began to show signs of transformation, thin cables growing through cracks in the concrete, clusters of small metal fragments embedded in the surface, like seeds waiting to germinate. The grinding sound grew louder as we approached the final descent to level 8. The countdown timer reached 0. The first impact was distant, a deep thud that traveled through the facility's structure and rattled dust from the ceiling joints. Then a second impact, closer, then a sustained series of explosions that blended together into a continuous roar. The floor shook hard enough that I had to brace against the wall. Overhead lights went out in sections, leaving gaps of darkness between emergency strips that continued to function on backup power. Olga activated her work light, casting a white beam down the corridor ahead. "We need to keep moving. If the upper levels collapse..." A section of ceiling 3 meters ahead buckled and dropped, punching through the floor and opening a gap that showed darkness below. We stopped at the edge and looked down. The gap was perhaps 2 meters wide, the edges jagged with exposed rebar and broken concrete. Through it I could see level 8, where the reactor chamber's reinforced walls glowed with faint amber light from emergency systems that had activated automatically when the main power fluctuated. And covering those walls, spreading across every surface, was growth. Not the thin cables and scattered fragments we had seen on the upper levels. This was dense, layered, complete. The walls were wrapped in material that looked like it had been woven from metal strands and organic cables, creating a texture that seemed to shift when the light hit it from different angles. Embedded in that texture were components I recognized, sections of the reactor housing, fuel pump assemblies, lengths of pipe that had been cut and repositioned, all of it incorporated into a structure that no longer resembled a Soviet test facility. The grinding sound came from below, originating somewhere deep in the reactor chamber. As I watched, a section of the wrapped wall bulged outward, then contracted, as if something underneath was testing the material's flexibility. Another impact from above sent more rubble falling. A chunk of concrete the size of a truck tire crashed through the gap and disappeared into the darkness of level 8. The edges of the hole began to widen as structural supports failed. "We cannot go around," I said. "Then we go through." I found a section of rebar that extended across the gap at waist height and tested my weight against it. It held. I swung one leg over and straddled the bar, then worked my way across while Olga held the light from behind. Halfway through, the rebar shifted under my weight, and I had to grab a ceiling support to keep from falling. I made it to the far side and turned to guide Olga across. She was lighter, moving faster. She reached the midpoint, and the rebar shifted again, this time pulling free from its anchor point on her side. She lunged forward, caught my extended hand, and I pulled her across as the rebar fell into the gap with a metallic clatter. We stood on the far side, breathing hard, while the bombardment continued above. The corridor ahead descended in a steep ramp toward level 8, its walls already showing extensive transformation. The growth here was thicker, covering the concrete in layers that bulged out into the walkable space. "Stay close," I said, and started down the ramp. The reactor level was warm, warmer than the levels above, as if something down here was generating heat. The emergency lighting cast amber shadows across walls that were no longer flat. They curved and bulged, creating spaces where equipment had been absorbed and repurposed. The fuel pump housing stood at the far end of a wide chamber, its metal casing wrapped in layers of cable-like growth. We crossed the chamber, stepping over fallen rubble and around clusters of material that had grown up from the floor like stalagmites. The grinding sound was louder here, coming from multiple directions, and underneath it I could hear something else, a clicking rhythm, fast and irregular, like claws on stone. Olga reached the pump housing first and began cutting through the growth with heavy shears, exposing the electrical panel underneath. "The main power line is severed. I need to bridge it from the junction box." She pointed to a box mounted on the wall 3 meters away. I crossed to it and pried open the cover with the bar. Inside, the circuits were intact but disconnected, the terminals showing no power. I found the main feed line and traced it back to where it emerged from the wall, and saw that it had been cut cleanly, the copper wire stripped away and incorporated into the surrounding growth. "The feed line is gone," I said. "Then we need to run a new one." She pulled cable from her pack and started measuring the distance. Behind us, something moved in the darkness beyond the amber light's reach, limbs working in coordination, weight shifting from one support to another. I turned and raised Grishkov's sidearm. In the shadows at the chamber's far end, shapes detached from the walls. They walked on 4 legs built from what might have been wolves or dogs originally, but their frames had been reinforced with so much additional material that their original forms were barely recognizable. Metal plates covered their backs and sides. Their heads were small relative to their bodies, and from their skulls extended clusters of thin rods that swiveled as they moved. They advanced slowly, spreading out to cover multiple approach angles. Behind them came something larger, a structure built on the frame of what I thought might have been a moose, but expanded and altered until it stood nearly 4 meters tall. Its body was a mass of layered plates, held together by cables that ran through what should have been empty space. And embedded in its torso, positioned where the chest cavity would have been on a living animal, was a human body, or what remained of one. The soldier's arms extended from the structure, as if he were embracing it from the inside. His head hung forward, face hidden, but I could see his back through gaps in the plates, and the spine visible there showed metal growing through the vertebrae like decorative threading. Olga dropped the cable and backed toward the pump housing. "Yakov!" I fired at the nearest wolf thing, hitting it in the skull. It stumbled but kept coming. I fired again, emptying the magazine into its frame until it collapsed. The other wolves split apart, circling to flank us. The larger structure continued its slow advance, grinding forward on legs that looked like they had been built from multiple limbs fused together. "How long to bridge the power?" I asked. 3 minutes if I work fast." "Then work fast." I reloaded and started firing at the wolves, aiming for joints and connection points where the reinforcement looked weakest. 2 more went down. The others retreated to positions along the chamber walls, staying out of effective range but not leaving. The larger structure reached the center of the chamber and stopped. The soldier embedded in its chest raised his head. His face was intact, features still recognizable, and his eyes opened. They tracked left, then right, scanning the chamber. When they found me, they stopped moving. His jaw worked without sound. Then his arms moved, reaching forward, hands spreading, fingers extending toward me in a gesture that could have been threat or invitation or something else entirely. Behind me, Olga was working on the junction box, stripping wire and making connections with quick, practiced movements. I kept my weapon aimed at the large structure, waiting to see what it would do. One of the wolves rushed from the side. I turned and fired, hitting it twice before it reached me. It crashed into my legs and knocked me down, its weight driving the air from my lungs. I rolled away and brought the pry bar up as another wolf came in, catching it under the jaw and levering its head back. The reinforced frame was stronger than natural bone, but the joints still had give. I pushed until something inside the wolf's neck broke with a wet crack and it went still. A third wolf was on me before I could stand. Its metal teeth closed on my left forearm and bit down, punching through jacket and flesh. I jammed the pry bar into its open mouth and pried the jaws apart, feeling my arm tear as the teeth released. The wolf staggered back and I shot it 3 times in the head. My arm pulsed blood, but the bones felt intact. I stripped my belt and wrapped it around the wound as a tourniquet, pulling it tight with my teeth. "Done," Olga called. "Power is restored to the pumps." The large structure in the center of the chamber had not moved during the fight. It stood motionless with the soldier's arms still extended, his eyes still tracking my position. Then, slowly, it began to turn away from us, rotating its mass toward the far end of the chamber, where the reactor housing sat wrapped in layers of growth. The wolves that remained alive retreated with it, moving in formation, as if responding to commands I could not hear. We backed toward the exit ramp, watching the structure until we were out of the chamber and climbing back toward level 7. Behind us, I heard the grinding sound resume, joined by new noises. Pumps activating, fuel flowing through restored lines, generators on the level above increasing their output as fresh diesel reached their tanks. The lure was stable. The wreck would stay. We made it to level 6 before Olga stopped walking. She leaned against the corridor wall and slid down to a sitting position, breathing hard. In the emergency lighting, I saw blood spreading across her abdomen, soaking through her jacket from a wound I had not noticed during the fight. I knelt beside her and opened her jacket. A piece of rebar protruded from just below her ribs on the left side, angled upward. It must have caught her when we crossed the gap between levels or during one of the impacts when rubble was falling. She had kept moving, kept working, kept bridging circuits while bleeding internally. "How bad?" she asked. I looked at the angle of the wound, the position of the metal, the amount of blood. "Bad." She nodded. "I thought so. It started hurting around the time we reached level 8. I figured I could finish the work first." I tried to assess whether pulling the rebar out would make things worse or better. It had penetrated deep enough that removing it would open vessels that were currently held partially closed by the metal's presence. She would bleed out in minutes. "I need to carry you to the command center," I said. "No, the systems need monitoring. The generators are running, but if the power distribution becomes unbalanced..." She stopped, took a breath that sounded wet. "You need to stay near the control stations. Make adjustments as the wreck grows. It will change the electrical load. The arrays might need recalibration. I do not know how to do that." "Then I will teach you." She pulled her handheld device from her belt and called up technical diagrams. "These are the primary systems. If generator output drops below 80%, you need to reduce load on the guidance arrays. If electromagnetic output exceeds tolerance thresholds, shut down the secondary antennas. The reactor coolant pumps need to run continuously. If they stop, the residual heat will build, and you will have approximately 6 hours before critical failure." She walked me through each system, explaining the key indicators and the responses they required. Her voice stayed level and professional even as her breathing became more labored. When she finished, she handed me the device. "That should be enough to keep things running for months, maybe longer if you are careful with the fuel." "Olga, I need you to promise something." She looked at me directly. "Document what happens here. Take notes, record observations. This is unprecedented. An alien intelligence consuming human weapons technology and repurposing it for growth. Someone needs to know how it works. I am a tracker, not a scientist. You are someone who notices things. That is enough." She coughed, and blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. "The wreck is not mindless. It took the soldier from level 8 and integrated him into a control structure. That implies cognitive processing, distributed intelligence. If you can understand the patterns..." She stopped talking, and her eyes closed. For a moment I thought she had died. Then she took another breath and opened her eyes again. "There is morphine in my pack. I do not want it yet. I need to stay clear long enough to make sure you understand the systems." We sat in the corridor while the bombardment continued above, and she walked me through every technical detail she could think of. Backup protocols, emergency overrides, warning signs that would indicate the generators were failing. When she was satisfied that I had absorbed enough to keep the facility running, she told me where to find the morphine. I administered the injection. Within minutes, her breathing slowed and the tension left her face. "Thank you," she said quietly. She died an hour later while I sat beside her holding her hand. I stayed with the body for another hour after that, partly because it seemed wrong to leave her alone in that corridor, and partly because I was not ready to face what came next. Finally I stood, took her pack and device, and carried both to the command center on level 4. The bombardment had stopped. According to the timer on the projection screen, the strike package had completed its mission 30 minutes earlier. The upper levels showed extensive damage. Collapsed sections, severed connections, large portions of the facility that were no longer structurally sound. But the lower levels remained green, sealed, functional. I set up a workstation at one of the control panels and began monitoring the systems Olga had taught me to watch. The generators were running smoothly. Fuel flow was stable. The guidance arrays were maintaining electromagnetic output within acceptable parameters. On the projection screen, the icons representing wreck growth had spread through most of Level 8 and were beginning to probe into Level 7. I pulled out my radio and switched to Volkov's channel. "This is Sidorov. The lure is operational. Fuel supplies sufficient for extended duration. The wreck is redirecting its growth toward the test range." Volkov responded after a brief delay. "Confirmed. Satellite imagery shows significant activity concentration at your position. The perimeter expansion vectors have stalled." A pause. "Dr. Kovalenko. Dead. Level 6. She stayed long enough to stabilize the systems." "Understood." Another pause. "Your transmission to civilian channels was received by multiple parties. I am obligated to inform you that broadcasting on emergency frequencies without authorization violates operational security protocols. File a complaint. I already have, along with a recommendation that the new exclusion boundaries incorporate your suggested territorial adjustments." Papers rustled in the background. "The maps will be distributed to regional administrators within the week. Your village and the northern grazing lands will remain accessible." "For how long?" "As long as the wreck remains contained at the test range, which, according to current projections, could be 5 to 10 years if the lure maintains effectiveness." He cleared his throat. "We are showing increased growth activity along the western tunnel route, the path you sent Sokolov through. He made it to the surface, but the tunnel collapsed 40 minutes later. You should consider that exit blocked." I looked at the schematic, at the spreading icons on levels 7 and 8, at the corridors that were being consumed one by one as the wreck followed the concentrations of metal and machinery deeper into the facility. "I am not planning to leave," I said. "Then you are planning to die." "I am planning to maintain the lure until the wreck is too deeply embedded to redirect. That might take days, might take weeks." I checked the generator status screens. "However long it takes, I will be here." "Why?" The question caught me off guard. I had expected Volkov to simply accept my choice without asking for justification. "Because this is my land," I said. "The rivers and the plateau and the forests where my people have lived since before your country existed. For 10 years I watched you map it, measure it, draw boundaries around it like you had the right to decide who could walk on ground their ancestors were buried in. I told myself I was just surviving, just taking your money and keeping my head down. But every route I mapped, every safe path I showed you, helped you prepare to take more. So now I am here, inside the nightmare you built on stolen land, making sure it eats this place first. And I will stay here until I am certain it is done." Volkov did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice had lost its bureaucratic distance. "The recorder you retrieved contains sufficient data to justify the containment operation. Dr. Kovalenko's analysis and your on-site actions provide evidence that the test range can serve as a long-term lure. Moscow will approve the boundary adjustments." He paused. "For what it costs you, I suppose that is something." "It is everything." "Then good luck, Sidorov. If you survive longer than projected, feel free to send updates. Otherwise..." He stopped. "Volkov out." I set the radio down and stared at the projection screen. The icons were spreading steadily, following power lines and structural supports, incorporating everything they touched into the growing mass. In 6 hours, they would reach level 6. In 12, they would be probing level 5. Within a week, The entire facility would be transformed. I pulled out Olga's handheld and started documenting what I could see on the screens. Growth patterns, power consumption changes, the speed at which different sections were being incorporated. She had been right. Someone needed to know how this worked, even if that someone was just me talking to myself in an empty command center. I worked through the first day without sleep, monitoring systems and making the small adjustments Olga had taught me. On the second day, the wreck reached level 5 and I had to abandon the command center, moving my workstation down to a maintenance room on level 3 that had its own power junction and communications access. On the third day, the generators began showing signs of strain, and I descended to level 7 to manually adjust fuel flow rates. The facility was no longer recognizable as human construction. The corridors had been wrapped in layers of growth that left only narrow paths between surfaces that seemed to breathe with slow, mechanical rhythm. The walls bulged with integrated equipment, computers, weapons guidance systems, reactor components, all of it threaded together in patterns I could not decipher. On the fifth day, I encountered one of the structures Olga had called distributed intelligence nodes. A pillar built from multiple human bodies and metal frames, positioned at a junction where 3 corridors met. The bodies were arranged in a vertical stack, their limbs extended outward to connect with machinery embedded in the surrounding walls. I recognized one of them from Patrol 17, his face still visible beneath a translucent layer of material that had grown over his features. The pillar tracked my movement with sensors I could not identify. I waited to see if it would react. It did not, remaining motionless except for small adjustments in its connecting cables. After several minutes, I walked past it to reach the generator room, and it let me pass without obstruction. It happened again on the 6th day, and again on the 7th. The structures watched, but did not interfere, as if I had been classified as something that belonged inside the facility, something that served a function the wreck recognized and permitted. I stayed in the maintenance room on level 3 and made my adjustments. Generator output, fuel consumption, electromagnetic array calibration. The work became routine, checking the same systems, making the same corrections, documenting the same patterns of growth. Weeks passed, then a month. The supplies I had salvaged from storage rooms began to run low. I rationed what remained. On the 32nd day, a section of wall in the maintenance room developed a crack. By the next morning, thin cables had grown through that crack and begun wrapping around the power junction I used to monitor the generators. I tried cutting them away, but they grew back faster than I could remove them. By the end of the week, the cables had integrated themselves into the junction, forming new connections that bypassed the original circuits. The strange part was that the system worked better after the integration. Power flow became more stable. Voltage fluctuations decreased. The wreck was improving the facility, optimizing it for purposes I did not fully understand. I stopped trying to cut the cables away. On the 47th day, I descended to level 7 to check the fuel reservoirs and found that one of the pumps had failed. I tried to repair it manually, but the housing had been so thoroughly wrapped in growth that I could not access the internal mechanisms. I sat down in front of the pump and tried to determine how long the remaining pumps would keep the generators running. While I sat there, cables began growing down from the ceiling above me. They moved slowly, extending toward the failed pump. I watched as they threaded through the housing, connected to internal components I could not see, and began pulsing with rhythmic contractions. The pump restarted. I stayed where I was, watching the cables work. Then I stood and walked back to level 3, my left arm aching where the wolf had bitten me 2 months earlier. The wound had healed poorly, leaving scars that pulled when I moved, and a section of skin where thin metal had begun to grow through from underneath. I had tried to cut it out in the first week, but the metal was fused to bone, and removing it would have meant losing function in my hand. So I left it. and learned to use the rough edge as a tool when I needed to strip wire or pry open junction boxes. On the 63rd day, the radio activated with a transmission from Volkov. The signal was weak, barely audible through interference, but I could make out the essential information. Perimeter sensors were showing minimal wreck activity outside the test range. The exclusion boundary adjustments had been approved and implemented. The village had been notified. Grazing rights on the northern plateau had been formally recognized in updated territorial maps. He asked if I was still alive. I confirmed that I was. He asked if the lure was holding. I told him it would hold for years, possibly decades. The wreck had embedded itself so deeply into the facility's structure that separating it from the test range would require dismantling both simultaneously. He wished me luck and signed off. I did not hear from him again. Months passed. The facility continued to transform. I moved my workstation twice more as sections of Level 3 became unsafe or were incorporated into the growing structure. I learned to read the patterns of growth, to anticipate where the wreck would expand next and which systems would need adjustment. I learned that certain frequencies in the electromagnetic array would cause growth to accelerate in specific directions, and that by adjusting those frequencies, I could guide where the wreck concentrated its attention. I learned to navigate terrain that no longer followed the original facility maps. Corridors that had been straight became curved. Rooms that had been separate merged into single chambers. And through it all, the distributed intelligence nodes watched and catalogued and permitted my presence because I was maintaining the lure that fed the larger structure. I became part of the facility's function, neither human nor hybrid, but something in between. A keeper of systems that required constant tending. A shepherd of growth that could only be guided, never controlled. My hair went grey. My left arm developed more metal integration, thin plates growing through the skin along my forearm, until I could use them to interface directly with certain junction boxes without needing tools. My vision changed, adapting to the low light of the deeper levels until I no longer needed to carry a work light. I stopped counting days. The supplies ran out and I learned to subsist on less. Water from the facility's purification system, which the wreck had somehow maintained. Rations from storage rooms on levels I had not yet explored. Eventually, even those ran low. My body adjusted. I worked. I monitored. I maintained.